Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of John Wayne Gacy. Imagine the city of Chicago in the early 1940s. The air is thick with the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of the elevated trains that rattle through the gray afternoon. It is a city of broad shoulders, of brick two-flats and narrow alleys where the wind from Lake Michigan howls with a lonely, mournful sound. We find ourselves in a quiet neighborhood on the north side, where the shadows of the elm trees stretch long across the pavement. Here, in this world of silent domesticity, a story began to take shape. A story of a boy who would learn, far too early, how to wear a mask that the world wanted to see. The silence of the streets belied the tension, growing within a single home on North Rockwell Street. On a cold St. Patrick's Day in 1942, at Edgewater Hospital, a son was born to John Stanley and Marion Gacy. They named him John Wayne Gacy, a name meant to evoke strength and grit. He was their only son, a middle child sandwiched between two sisters. The home they occupied was modest, a place where the floorboards creaked under the weight of a father who carried the scars of World War I and the heavy, sour scent of the bottle. From the very beginning, the air in that house was charged with an unpredictable electricity. You could feel it in the way the kitchen grew silent when a heavy footstep sounded on the porch. Little John was a quiet child, born with a heart that did not quite beat with the rhythm it should have, a congenital defect that made his breath come a little shorter than the other boys. John Stanley Gacy was a man of iron and anger. He worked as an auto repair machinist, a man whose hands were always stained with grease and oil, hands that knew the tension of a wrench and the bite of a belt. He looked at his son and saw someone he did not understand, a boy who was sensitive and preferred the company of his mother and sisters to the rough world of the street. The abuse started early, a jagged rhythm of verbal lashes and physical strikes. For the crime of playing with car parts at the age of 4, or for simply being too slow to understand a command, the belt would find him. His father called him a sissy and a mama's boy, words spat out in the dim light of a Chicago evening. These were the first bricks in the wall John would build around his soul to survive. When John was 11 years old, the world tilted on its axis. He was playing near a swing set, the rhythmic creak of the metal chains a soothing sound in the summer heat. Suddenly, a heavy wooden swing struck him in the forehead with a sickening thud. The world went black, a sudden eclipse of the sun. He did not tell his father the full extent of the pain, fearing another outburst, another accusation of weakness. For the next 5 years, the blackouts would come for him like sudden dives into deep, dark water. One moment he was standing in a classroom, and the next, he was waking up on the floor with no memory. It was not until he was 16 that doctors found a blood clot on his brain, a silent, pulsing pressure that had been governing his consciousness for half a decade. Imagine the isolation of those years, drifting in and out of reality. Coupled with the blackouts was his failing heart. The doctors told him he must avoid sports, preventing him from being the athlete his father so desperately desired. While the neighbors' children played baseball in the alleys, John watched from the porch, a silent observer of a life he was not allowed to join. He turned instead to the Boy Scouts and to helping his mother around the house, seeking approval in the only ways he could. He was a helpful boy, his teachers said, a child who went out of his way to be useful. But even this was a performance. Deep down, the shame of being different and the terror of his father's drunken wrath were forging something cold and hard. He was learning that a smile could be a shield, and that if you were busy enough, people might not look too closely at the darkness growing in the corners. By the time the 1950s were drawing to a close, John Wayne Gacy had become a master of the mask. He was the teenager with the newspaper route, the boy who worked at the grocery store, the son who took the beatings without a sound. He had learned to lock his tears away, knowing that they only fueled his father's contempt. He looked at the mirror and saw a person who did not exist, a construction of manners and compliance designed to survive the storm of his household. The physical pain of his heart and his head became background noise to a much deeper, more profound ache, the need to be powerful, the need to never be the victim again. As we leave these early years, the foundation has been laid. The bricks are in place, the mortar is dry, and the painted smile is beginning to set, a permanent fixture on a face that was quickly forgetting how to feel. The transition from the sprawling complexity of Chicago to the quiet, rhythmic life of Waterloo, Iowa, in 1964 was more than just a change of scenery for John Wayne Gacy. It was a calculated rebirth. Imagine the soft, humid air of a Midwestern morning, the smell of damp earth from the Cedar River, and the sight of manicured lawns where every blade of grass seemed to whisper of normalcy. Gacy arrived here with his new bride, Marlon Myers, moving into a home provided by her parents. To the neighbors, they were the picture of young, ambitious American stability. He was a man who walked with purpose, his shoes always polished, his smile wide and practiced, as if he were auditioning for the role of the perfect husband and neighbor every single day. In Waterloo, Gacy didn't just find a home, he found a stage. His father-in-law, a man of standing, placed him in charge of 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises. This wasn't merely a job, it was a kingdom. Picture the low hum of industrial fryers, the heavy, savory scent of grease that clung to his clothes, and the rhythmic clicking of the cash registers. Gacy was an obsessive manager, often working 12 or 14 hours a day. He took pride in the efficiency of his staff, mostly young men who looked up to him as a successful, older brother figure. He was the boss who knew everyone's name, the man who brought order to the chaos of the kitchen, and for a time, the mask of the professional provider was indistinguishable from the skin beneath. By 1967, the mask was further reinforced by his rising status in the Waterloo JCs. This was an organization of young leaders, a place where handshakes and community service defined a man's worth. Gacy excelled here, throwing himself into every committee and fundraiser with a manic energy that bordered on the desperate. He was named the outstanding vice president of the chapter, a title that felt like a shield against any shadow of doubt. He moved through the town's social circles with the confidence of a man who believed his own lies. In public, he was the model citizen, a father to a young son and soon a daughter, a man who would give the shirt off his back to help a friend. But even then, there were whispers. Small, jagged pieces of a different reality were beginning to poke through the smooth surface of his reputation. Deep in the basement of his Iowa home, Gacy had created a private world that stood in stark contrast to the sunny life he presented upstairs. He built a private clubroom, complete with a pool table and a bar stocked with alcohol. It was a space designed to lure the young men he supervised at the restaurants and the teenagers he met through the JCs. Under the guise of mentorship and brotherhood, he would invite them into this subterranean sanctuary. The air there was different, cooler, dampened by the concrete walls, and thick with the tension of things unsaid. Here, the boundaries of his public life began to dissolve. He would ply these young men with drinks, watching them through the haze of cigarette smoke, waiting for the moment when the power dynamic shifted entirely in his favor. The shadow finally lengthened and became impossible to ignore in 1968. A 15-year-old boy named Donald, the son of a fellow JC member, came forward with a story that shattered the illusion of Gacy's respectability. He spoke of an evening where the liquor flowed too freely, and the hospitality of the basement turned into something predatory. Gacy, ever the master of the counter-narrative, reacted with a cold, calculated fury. He didn't just deny the allegations, he attempted to erase the witness. He went so far as to hire another youth, paying him $300 to find the boy and physically assault him, hoping to intimidate him into silence before the trial could begin. It was a move born of arrogance, a belief that his influence in the town could still protect him from the truth. But the gears of justice in Waterloo were turning, and Gacy's political connections couldn't stop them. The youth he hired was caught and quickly confessed, leading the police right back to the man in the suit. On December 3, 1968, the community watched in stunned silence as their man of the year pleaded guilty to a single count of sodomy. The sentence was 10 years. On that very same day, the domestic life he had so carefully curated collapsed. Marlon, the woman who had shared his home and his children, filed for divorce. She requested sole custody and the house, effectively cutting him out of the life he had built. It was a total rejection, a stripping away of the identity he had worn like a second skin for 4 long years. Gacy was sent to the Enigma State Penitentiary, a formidable stone fortress known as the Iowa State Men's Reformatory. Inside those cold, gray walls, he didn't wither, he adapted. He became the model inmate, a man who understood how to navigate the hierarchy of prison life, just as he had navigated the JCs. He worked in the kitchen, preparing meals for the staff and the warden, using his culinary background to secure a position of comfort and trust. He was social, helpful, and seemingly remorseful. He even organized the construction of a miniature golf course on the prison grounds, a bizarre touch of suburban normalcy within the confines of a penitentiary. To the officials watching him, he appeared to be a man who had made a single, terrible mistake and was now fully rehabilitated. Because of this performance, the 10-year sentence was drastically reduced. After serving only 18 months, John Wayne Gacy was granted parole in 1970. He walked out of the prison gates with a clean suit and a recommendation for good behavior. The state of Iowa was finished with him, believing they had corrected a wayward soul. He left Waterloo behind, the broken marriage, the 2 children he would never see again, and the reputation he had burned to the ground. He turned his eyes back toward Chicago, the city of his birth, carrying with him a new, more dangerous understanding of how to hide in plain sight. The mask had failed once, and he was determined that next time, it would be bolted on much more tightly. The transition back to the rhythmic, industrious hum of Chicago was swift and calculated. After serving only 18 months of his 10-year sentence in Iowa, the man who had been cast out as a predator returned to his roots with a renewed, sharpened focus on the facade of respectability. He did not skulk in the shadows of his past. Instead, he stepped into the light of the windy city, fueled by an obsessive need to rebuild his image. By 1971, he had established PDM contractors, standing for painting, decorating, and maintenance. It was more than a business. It was a vehicle for social climbing. He hired local teenagers, becoming a mentor in the eyes of the community, a man who provided jobs and learned the secrets of every home he touched. The scent of fresh sawdust and turpentine followed him, masking the deeper, darker impulses that had only been suppressed, never extinguished, during his time behind bars. With financial assistance from his mother, a new stage was set in the unincorporated township of Norwood Park. The address was 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. It was a modest, ranch-style home, clad in sturdy brick and surrounded by the quiet, unassuming lawns of middle-class suburbia. To any passerby, it was a symbol of the American dream realized. The house sat low to the ground, its windows reflecting the gray, winter skies of Illinois. Inside, the floor plan was functional, but beneath the living room and kitchen lay a feature that would eventually define the property's horrific legacy. It was a crawl space, a shallow, dark void of damp earth, barely a few feet high, accessible only through a small hatch. At first, it was merely an architectural detail, a place for pipes and insulation, but as he settled into his new life, the void beneath the floorboards began to mirror the growing emptiness within his own soul. The winter of 1972 arrived with a biting, frost-laden wind that whipped through the corridors of the Greyhound bus terminal at 161 North Clark Street. On the evening of January 2nd, the station was a crossroads of weary travelers and flickering neon lights. Among them was 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy. Timothy was a boy from Omaha, Nebraska, traveling home after a holiday visit with friends in Michigan. He was young, perhaps appearing even younger than his years, and he was waiting for a connecting bus that wasn't due until the following noon. In the cavernous, echoing station, he was a solitary figure, a transient soul in a city that could be as cold as the ice on Lake Michigan. It was here that the contractor, driving his dark sedan, found his first opportunity. He approached the boy with a practiced ease, offering a warm meal and a place to rest until the morning bus arrived. The drive from the bus terminal to the quiet street in Norwood Park was a carefully constructed tour of hospitality. He pointed out the landmarks of Chicago, the tall buildings and the city lights, playing the role of the generous host to the impressionable teenager. Timothy, likely grateful for a reprieve from the hard plastic chairs of the bus station, accepted the invitation to stay at the house on West Somerdale Avenue. They arrived late, the neighborhood hushed and tucked away under a blanket of winter gloom. Inside the ranch home, the air was warm. They shared drinks and conversation, a deceptive domesticity filling the rooms while the rest of the world slept. The boy believed he had found a benefactor, a kind stranger who would ensure his safe passage home to his father in Nebraska. But as the clock ticked toward the early hours of January 3rd, the atmosphere in the house began to shift, the warmth turning into something heavy and predatory. According to the story the killer would later weave for investigators, he woke up in the early morning to find Timothy standing in his bedroom doorway, holding a kitchen knife. He claimed the boy was preparing breakfast but had startled him, leading to a struggle. It was a narrative designed to cast himself as the victim, yet the reality was far more gruesome. In a sudden, violent eruption, the hospitality vanished. He lunged at the teenager, wrestling him to the floor. The silence of the suburban morning was shattered by the frantic struggle. Using the very knife he claimed was meant for breakfast, he stabbed the 16-year-old boy repeatedly in the chest. As Timothy's life faded away on the bedroom floor, the contractor did not panic. He did not call for help. Instead, he felt a chilling sense of calm. The threshold had been crossed. The first murder had been committed within the walls of 8213 West Somerdale, and the house had claimed its first spirit. With the body of Timothy McCoy lying still, the killer looked toward the floorboards. He opened the small, unassuming hatch that led to the crawl space. The air that rose from the opening was musty and cold, smelling of ancient soil and stagnant moisture. He dragged the boy's body into the darkness, navigating the narrow, cramped confines of the dirt floor. There, beneath the kitchen and the living room where he would later entertain neighbors and politicians, he dug a shallow grave. He placed Timothy face down in the earth, covering him with the dark soil and eventually a layer of concrete. As he emerged back into the light of his home and washed the blood from his hands, he realized how easy it had been. The secret was buried, literally, beneath the foundation of his respectable life. The crawl space was no longer just a utility area, it had become a tomb. And for Timothy Jack McCoy, now known only to the killer as the Greyhound bus boy, the journey home to Nebraska would never be completed. The year 1973 began with a heavy, deceptive silence that blanketed the one-story ranch house on Somerdale Avenue. After the disappearance of Timothy McCoy, the neighborhood seemed to settle back into its familiar rhythm, unaware that the soil beneath their feet had begun to hold its first dark secret. John Wayne Gacy understood the value of a curated image better than anyone. In the middle of 1973, he quit his job as a cook to commit fully to his business, PDM Contractors. He walked the streets of Chicago with a practiced air of confidence, his truck becoming a familiar sight in the suburbs. But beneath this industrious life, A hunger was growing, a need for control that business could not satisfy. He watched the young men who drifted through the city, seeing them not as people, but as opportunities. The facade was perfect, the lawn was manicured, and the true monster remained hidden behind a smile and a firm, calloused handshake. As 1974 arrived, the disappearances remained quiet ripples in a vast, uncaring ocean. Chicago was a place where young men frequently vanished into the neon glow of bus stations or the shadows of city parks. In January of 1974, a second victim was lured into the house. While his name remains lost to time, his fate was sealed with a clinical coldness. Gacy had begun to perfect his routine, a terrifying dance of manipulation. He would bring his victims home, showing them magic tricks or his police badges to establish a false sense of security. The handcuff trick was his favorite, an escape demonstration that turned into a permanent trap. This unidentified young man was strangled and briefly hidden in a bedroom closet before the dark earth of the crawl space claimed him. He joined the growing silence beneath the floorboards, another secret tucked away while the suburban world went about its business. By late 1974, PDM Contractors was expanding rapidly, and Gacy worked 16-hour days managing several projects simultaneously. Much of his workforce consisted of high school students and young men, drawn to his boisterous personality and the promise of steady pay. He was a precinct captain who hosted large summer parties for hundreds of people. The air at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue was filled with laughter and the smell of barbecue, yet a faint, cloying odor began to linger. When visitors or his wife questioned the scent, Gacy was ready with a contractor's excuse. He spoke of moisture buildup and sewer problems, his explanations delivered with such authority that no one dared to look deeper. He was a man who could look his neighbors in the eye while standing directly above a grave, his mask never slipping even as the crawl space beneath the living room became a crowded, silent tomb. The heat of July, 1975, brought a confrontation that tested Gacy's control to its limits. John Butkovich was 18 years old, a strong boy who had worked for Gacy's company for 2 years. There had been a bitter dispute over 2 weeks of outstanding back pay. On the evening of July 30th, 1975, John went to the house to demand what he was owed. Gacy, the master of the calm facade, invited the boy inside to settle up the debt. But the conversation was merely a prelude to violence. Gacy conned the 18-year-old into the handcuffs, promising to release him once he calmed down. The struggle was muffled by the thick walls and the sound of the television. Gacy later admitted to sitting on the boy's chest, watching the life fade from his eyes before using a garrote to finish the task. It was a calculated end for a boy who only wanted his fair share. The burial of John Butkovich required a change in plans. Gacy's wife and stepdaughters returned from a trip earlier than expected, cutting off access to the trapdoor leading to the crawl space. Gacy moved the body to the garage instead. He spent the dark hours of the early morning laboring in the humid air, the sound of the shovel hitting the dirt, a rhythmic scrape against the night. He dug a grave beneath the floor of the tool room, a space where he had planned to install a drain tile. The sensory details were etched into the foundation, the smell of wet cement, the grit of sand, and the heavy air clinging to his skin. By sunrise, the garage floor was smooth and gray, a perfect surface. To the world, it was just another home improvement project. But beneath that stone lay a stolen life, sealed away by the man the neighborhood called a friend. The neighborhood of Norwood Park was a portrait of Midwestern tranquility in the 1970s. Here, the streets were lined with modest ranch houses, their lawns neatly manicured, and their windows glowing with the warm, amber light of family dinners. At 8213 West Somerdale Avenue, one house stood as a testament to the American dream. It was a brick home, sturdy and well-maintained, with a driveway that often held a clean blue and white pickup truck. This was the home of John Wayne Gacy, a man who seemed to embody the very spirit of the helpful neighbor. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the pavement, you might have seen him out there. He was a large man, gregarious and quick with a joke, always ready to lend a tool or offer advice on a home repair. The air in the neighborhood usually smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint, sweet scent of charcoal grills, a perfect suburban symphony that suggested nothing but safety and peace. John was a man of industry. He ran a successful business called PDM Contractors, an acronym for painting, decorating, and maintenance. His business card was a common sight in the pockets of local residents. For many in the area, the hum of his commercial paint sprayers and the rhythmic tap of his hammers were the sounds of progress. He was known for his work ethic, often seen coordinating crews of young men who moved through the neighborhood in their white work clothes. These young men were often runaways or kids looking for a fresh start, and John presented himself as their benefactor, a man giving them a chance to earn a decent wage. But inside that blue and white truck, the atmosphere was different. The scent of paint thinner and sawdust masked something sharper, something metallic. While the neighbors saw a businessman building a legacy, the young men on his crews sometimes felt a shifting energy, a predatory gaze that lingered just a second too long behind a friendly smile. His influence reached far beyond the edges of his property line. John was a fixture in local politics, a Democratic precinct captain who knew how to navigate the intricate machinery of Chicago power. He was the director of the annual Polish Constitution Day parade, a position of significant prestige. Imagine the pride he felt on May 6, 1978, when he stood beside the First Lady of the United States, Rosalind Carter. In the famous photograph taken that day, John is smiling, his face rounded and jovial, wearing a dark suit and a special security clearance pin on his lapel. The Secret Service had vetted him, or so it seemed. To the world, he was a super citizen, a man so trusted that he could stand within inches of the most powerful people in the country. He kept that autographed photo displayed with immense pride, a shield of respectability that he used to deflect any growing whispers or suspicions. It was a golden ticket, a validation that he was exactly who he claimed to be. But perhaps the most striking layer of his public mask was found in a trunk filled with colorful fabric and grease paint. John was a member of the Jolly Jokers Clown Club. He had two distinct personas: Patches, who was a more serious and educational clown, and Pogo, the happy, chaotic entertainer. The transformation into Pogo was a slow, deliberate ritual. He would sit before a mirror, carefully applying a thick base of white grease paint, followed by oversized blue eyes and a massive, exaggerated red smile. He wore a custom jumpsuit with bold stripes and large pom-poms, a costume designed to delight children at hospitals and neighborhood parties. When he was Pogo, he felt he could regress into a different world, one where the rules of adulthood didn't apply. He would twist balloons into animals and perform magic tricks, his laughter echoing through suburban backyards. There is a chilling irony in the image of a man who entertained the innocent by day, while harboring a charnel house beneath his floorboards at night. He once told investigators that clowns could get away with murder, a statement that reveals the terrifying depth of the disguise he wore so convincingly. Every summer, the house on Summerdale Avenue became the center of the neighborhood's social life. John hosted massive, themed parties that saw as many as 400 guests spilling out onto his patio and lawn. There were politicians, business associates, and families from all around. The smell of roasting meat and the sound of clinking glasses filled the air. People laughed and danced, unaware that just a few feet below their polished shoes, the crawl space was becoming a crowded graveyard. John would walk among them, the perfect host, handing out drinks and making everyone feel welcome. Sometimes, a guest might comment on a strange, sickly sweet odor wafting from the vents, a smell that seemed out of place in such a clean home. John always had a ready answer. He would blame the dampness of the Illinois soil, a broken sewage pipe, or a moisture problem in the crawl space. He spoke with such confidence and such technical detail about the plumbing issues that his guests simply nodded, adjusted their napkins, and went back to their conversations, blinded by the sheer normalcy of the man standing before them. Inside the house, the decor reflected a man who lived between worlds. His living room was set up like a professional office, a place for business deals and political strategy. One bedroom was converted into a massive terrarium, filled with exotic plants and the slow movement of reptiles. His kitchen was described as being more like a fast food station than a family heart, efficient and sterile. This was a man who had curated every inch of his existence to serve a purpose. He wasn't just living a double life. He was maintaining a complex ecosystem of deception. He was the neighbor who plowed your driveway for free, the contractor who fixed your porch, the politician who fought for your streetlights, and the clown who made your children laugh. He was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of the community. This was the ultimate horror of John Wayne Gacy. He didn't hide in the woods or the dark alleys of the city. He lived in the house next door, and he wore the face of a friend. As we move deeper into the night, remember that the brightest smiles can sometimes hide the darkest secrets. Rest now, for the truth is beginning to surface, and the mask is starting to crack. The year 1976 arrived in Chicago with a heavy, biting frost that settled deep into the city. For John Wayne Gacy, this year marked a transition into a singular, darker life. His second wife, Carol, had moved out, leaving the ranch house on Summerdale Avenue to its owner and his growing secrets. The house was quieter now, but the silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, expectant stillness. Inside, the walls held the echoes of a man who was becoming more practiced in the art of the lure. He was a respected contractor with his company, PDM Contractors, and a man who always had an answer for everything. But beneath the polished veneer of his professional life, a pattern was beginning to solidify. The shadows in the crawl space were growing, and for the families of the young men in the neighborhood, a long, agonizing winter of the soul was just beginning. In December of 1976, the holiday lights did little to warm Eugenia Godzik. Her 17-year-old son, Gregory, was a boy with a heart of gold, a student at Taft High School who spent his spare time working for Gacy's construction crew to save money for car parts. On the evening of December 12th, Gregory dropped his date at her home and promised to be back shortly. He never returned. The next morning, when Eugenia saw his blankets undisturbed, a cold dread seized her that no winter wind could match. She knew her son. He never stayed out without calling. He never missed a night at home. Gregory was not a boy who would simply vanish by choice. But when the Godzik family reached out to the authorities, they were met with a wall of indifference that would become all too familiar to the families of the missing. The police response was a clinical, dismissive refrain. "Your son is a runaway." At the time, there was a common belief that teenage boys were prone to rebellion, fleeing for the freedom of the road. Despite the parents' protests, the search was slow to start. Desperate, the Godziks turned to the last person who had seen Gregory, his employer, John Wayne Gacy. Gacy welcomed them with a sympathetic face, but his words were calculated. He told them Gregory had mentioned wanting to run away, even going so far as to claim he had an answering machine message from the boy confirming his departure. When the family asked to hear it, Gacy simply said he had already erased it. While Gregory's parents moved his Christmas gifts to a closet, hoping he would walk through the door, his body was already hidden beneath the house he had once helped maintain. The new year, 1977, brought no relief. In January, 19-year-old John Scheich became the next name on the list of the vanished. John was an acquaintance of Gacy, and on the 20th of January, he went to the house on Summerdale Avenue with a simple plan. He was going to sell his car, a Plymouth Satellite, to the contractor. John was a young man starting his own life, having recently moved into his own apartment. He was not a drifter. When he failed to show up for work, his mother's alarm was immediate. Yet, once again, the narrative was rewritten by the predator. Gacy eventually sold the car to another employee, and when the police traced the vehicle back to him, he calmly explained that the boy had sold it to him to fund a trip. The police shared this with John's mother as if it were a closed case. They did not look into the man who sat comfortably in his living room, surrounded by stolen belongings. By the time November of 1977 arrived, the silence in the neighborhood felt heavy. Robert Winch was only 16 years old when he crossed paths with Gacy at a local McDonald's. Robert was a vulnerable soul, a boy who had run away from a foster home and was looking for a way to survive in a cold city. He was the perfect target for a man who promised work and a warm place to stay. Robert vanished into the night of November 11th, leaving behind only a distinctive belt buckle with a tiger's eye stone, a small piece of his identity that would later be found among Gacy's collection of trophies. The police, seeing Robert's history as a runaway, were quick to categorize him as another child who did not want to be found. They did not see the pattern of the silver car or the common employer. They saw only the boys they deemed unimportant. The families were left to dwell in a state of suspended animation, their lives frozen in the moment of disappearance. They were told to wait, to be patient, and to accept that their sons had simply chosen a different path. In the house on Summerdale, Gacy continued his lies. He complained about the moisture in the crawl space, the smell of the damp earth, and the faulty plumbing. He used the dead heat of the Chicago summers and the sewage leaks of the winters as excuses for the rot that was beginning to permeate his home. The silence grew thicker, a suffocating blanket over the truth. The desperation of the parents was a whisper in the ears of the law, while the man they trusted continued to build his walls of lies. The darkness was no longer hidden under the floorboards. It was in the apathy of those meant to protect the innocent. The air in Des Plaines, Illinois, on the evening of December 11th, 1978, was a biting, crystalline force that rattled the glass panes of the Nissen Pharmacy. Inside, the world was softer, smelling of paper, antiseptic, and the faint, sweet scent of holiday candy. 15-year-old Robert Peast was finishing his shift, a young man known for his bright smile and his dependable nature. He was an honor student, a boy with a future as vast as the winter sky. On this particular Monday, the pharmacy was quiet, the hum of the overhead lights providing a steady rhythm to the mundane tasks of restocking shelves and straightening aisles. It was a day that should have ended with a warm house and a birthday celebration, as his mother, Elizabeth, was waiting for him. She was turning 46 that day, and a cake was resting on their kitchen table, its candles waiting for a flame that would never be lit. During that shift, a small, seemingly insignificant exchange occurred between Robert and his coworker, 17-year-old Kim Byers. The pharmacy was drafty, and Kim, stationed near the front entrance, felt the frigid gusts every time the door swung open. To keep warm, she asked Robert if she could borrow his favorite blue parka. He agreed, with the easy kindness that defined him. While wearing the heavy coat, Kim took a moment to fill out a red and white envelope for a roll of film she wanted to develop. She tore off the top slip, the photo receipt, and instead of throwing it away, she felt a strange, inexplicable urge to keep it. She folded the small piece of paper and tucked it deep into the right-hand pocket of Robert's parka. She didn't know then that this tiny fragment of paper would eventually become a beacon in the darkness, a physical tether between a missing boy and a monster. As the evening progressed, a man entered the pharmacy. He was large, overweight, with thinning brown hair and a presence that seemed to fill the room with a practiced, hollow warmth. This was John Wayne Gacy, a local contractor who was there to discuss a remodeling project with the store owner. As he walked the aisles, he spoke loudly enough for Robert to hear, mentioning that his company, PDM Contractors, was looking for summer help. He spoke of paying $5 an hour, a staggering sum in 1978, nearly double the minimum wage of $2.50. To a 15-year-old boy looking to save for his future, it sounded like a dream. Around 9 o'clock, Robert told Kim he was going to step outside for just a moment to talk to the contractor about the job. He put his blue parka back on, the receipt still resting in the pocket, and walked toward the door. He looked at his mother, waiting patiently in the car, and mouthed the words, "I will be right back." The minutes stretched into an hour. Elizabeth Peast sat in the pharmacy, her breath fogging the windows as she watched the parking lot. The store began to close. The lights flickered and died, leaving only the security lamps to cast long, distorted shadows across the linoleum floor. Her son did not return. The contractor's car was gone, and the snow outside remained undisturbed except for a single set of tire tracks leading away into the night. Panic, cold and sharp, began to settle in her chest. Robert was not a runaway. He was a boy who loved his family, a boy who wouldn't dream of missing his mother's birthday. By the time the Des Plaines police were notified, the silence of the night had become a heavy shroud. Lieutenant Joseph Kozingzak took the case, and unlike many who might dismiss a missing teenager, he felt a deep, intuitive wrongness about the situation. He focused his attention on the last person seen with Robert, the man with the silver-laced hair, and the contractor's bid. The investigation moved with a quiet, desperate intensity. When police first questioned Gacy, he was dismissive, his voice smooth and untroubled. He claimed he had never even spoken to the Peast boy. But the police didn't look away. They secured a search warrant for his home at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. Entering that house was an experience that many officers would never forget. The air inside was thick and cloying, a mixture of heat and a sickly, sweet odor that Gacy insisted was merely sewer gas caused by the winter dampness in the crawlspace. They searched the rooms, moving through the clutter of a man who seemed to lead a normal, busy life. They looked through drawers, under furniture, and into the wastebaskets. It was there, amidst the discarded remnants of a household, that they found a crumpled piece of paper. It was the red and white photo receipt from the Nissen Pharmacy, clearly marked with the name of Kim Byers and the date of December 11th. That receipt was the breaking point. It was the physical evidence that shattered Gacy's carefully constructed lie. If he had never met Robert Peast, how did a receipt from Robert's coat pocket end up in Gacy's trash? The small slip of paper, which Kim Byers had tucked away on a whim, became the key that unlocked the most horrific crime scene in American history. It provided the probable cause the police needed to dig deeper, to look beneath the floorboards and into the darkness of the crawlspace. As the officers stood in that house, holding the receipt, the weight of the truth began to settle over them. The boy who had promised to be right back was gone, but he had left behind a message that could not be ignored. The trail of the receipt led directly to the shadows beneath the house, where 33 young lives had been silenced. The net was finally tightening, and the man who hid behind the mask of a friendly neighbor could no longer escape the light. The chill of December in Illinois is a singular kind of cold. It settles into the marrow of your bones and refuses to leave. Outside the modest ranch house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, the air was brittle, crackling with the frost of 1978. For the detectives sitting in their unmarked cars, the world had narrowed down to the glow of the dashboard lights and the silhouette of that unassuming brick home. They were there for Robert Peast, the 15-year-old boy who had vanished into the winter mist. But as the hours turned into days, the scope of their vigil began to shift. The silence of the neighborhood was deceptive. Underneath the blanket of snow and the quiet suburban routine, a clock was ticking, and the man inside was starting to crack. John Wayne Gacy did not behave like a man with secrets buried in his floorboards. Instead of hiding, he leaned into the spotlight of the investigation with a manic, unsettling energy. He knew the police were there, watching his every move from the curb, and he decided to play the role of the misunderstood citizen. He would walk out into the freezing night, the crunch of the snow beneath his boots the only sound, and approach the surveillance vehicles. He didn't come with threats, he came with invitations. He offered the officers coffee to ward off the chill, or he would suggest they come inside to warm their hands by the fire. It was a calculated performance of innocence, designed to make the detectives feel like intruders in the life of a pillar of the community. Step inside that house, and the atmosphere changed instantly. The layout was strange, a reflection of Gacy's fractured life. The living room didn't feel like a place for a family to gather. It felt like a cramped corporate office, cluttered with the paperwork of his construction business. There were plaques on the walls, photos of him with influential people, and the ever-present remnants of his life as a clown. But as Officer Schultz and his partners sat at Gacy's kitchen table, accepting the hospitality of a predator, they began to notice something that no amount of air freshener or peppermint could hide. It was a heavy, musty weight in the air. Gacy laughed it off, claiming the house was built on a damp patch of land, and that the moisture beneath the floor was simply the smell of the earth. The turning point came in the smallest of rooms. When Officer Schultz stepped into the bathroom, the house was silent for a moment, save for the low hum of the refrigerator. Then, the furnace kicked on. A rush of warm air began to circulate through the vents, and with it came a scent that froze the blood in his veins. It wasn't just damp earth or old pipes. It was the thick, unmistakable aroma of organic decay. It was a sickly, sweet, cloying smell that seemed to cling to the back of the throat. In that confined space, with the heat rising from the floor, the stench was overwhelming. It was the smell of a morgue that had been left to simmer. Schultz stepped back into the hallway, his face pale, realizing that the thaw Gacy spoke of wasn't the coming of spring, but the physical reality of what lay hidden in the dark. Gacy's behavior outside the home became even more erratic as the pressure mounted. He would lead the detectives on high-speed chases through the winding streets, only to pull over and berate them for their driving. One evening, in a display of pure hubris, he drove to a local restaurant and insisted the officers join him for dinner. He introduced them to his acquaintances as his bodyguards, a joke that felt like a serrated blade. He was the director of a surreal play, forcing the men who were hunting him to sit at his table and break bread. Beneath his jovial exterior, however, the mask was slipping. His eyes were darting, his speech becoming a rapid-fire stream of consciousness, and his hands would sometimes shake as he lit one cigarette after another. He was a man unraveling under the yellow glare of the streetlights. The surveillance lasted for 7 long days and nights, a grueling test of endurance for the Des Plaines police. They watched as Gacy's support system began to crumble, as the friends and employees he had used as a shield started to pull away under the weight of the investigation. The house on Summerdale Avenue stood like a silent witness to it all. Every time the wind shifted, the detectives caught another phantom drift of that terrible odor. It was as if the ground itself was trying to speak, to vomit up the truth that had been pressed into the dirt for years. They knew they were close. They knew that the man who had entertained children was standing on the precipice of a total collapse. The vigil was no longer just about a missing boy. It was about the dozens of ghosts crying out from beneath the floorboards. As the final hours of his freedom ticked away, Gacy's desperation became a physical presence. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own making, yet he still believed he could talk his way out of the inevitable. The detectives remained steadfast, their eyes burning from lack of sleep, their senses heightened to every flicker of light in his windows. They stayed because they had to, because the scent of the crawlspace had followed them home, staining their clothes and their memories. The thaw was coming, and with it, the quiet suburban life on Summerdale would be forever replaced by the grim reality of the bodies that were about to be brought into the light. The 24-hour vigil was almost over, but the nightmare was only just beginning. The shadows were retreating, and the truth was finally ready to emerge. The morning of December 21st, 1978, arrived with a bitter, biting cold that seemed to freeze the very air over Norwood Park Township. For the detectives standing on the porch of the ranch-style house on Summerdale Avenue, the chill was more than just the winter wind. It was the weight of a second search warrant, a legal key that would finally unlock the heavy silence Gacy had maintained for so long. As the door opened, the warmth of the interior spilled out, but it brought with it something else, a thick, cloying atmosphere that felt heavy in the lungs. Inside, the house was a strange hybrid of a bachelor's lair and a contractor's office, cluttered with the remnants of a man who lived multiple lives. The investigators moved with a quiet, practiced focus, their boots thudding softly on the floors that, unbeknownst to them, were the only things separating them from a nightmare. Every room they entered seemed to hold its breath, but it was the smell that commanded the most attention. It was a scent Gacy had explained away for years, telling his wife and his guests that the damp earth of the Illinois plains was simply reclaiming the moisture beneath the foundation. He had blamed faulty sewage pipes and the humidity of the Midwest summers, but in the stillness of that December morning, the lie began to fray at the edges. One of the officers noticed a small, unremarkable access hatch. It was tucked away, a gateway to the dark, unfinished space beneath the floorboards. When that hatch was pulled back, the stench intensified, a sickening mixture of wet earth, rot, and the sharp, chemical tang of the quicklime Gacy had scattered like a grisly shroud. The air that rose from the darkness was stagnant and old, carrying the weight of years of secrets. With flashlights cutting through the gloom, the detectives peered into the crawlspace. It was a narrow, claustrophobic expanse, barely 3 feet high, where the dirt was soft and uneven. The beams of light danced over the mounds of earth, highlighting the strange, unnatural contours of the ground. It did not take long for the first horrifying confirmation to emerge. A shovel was brought in, and with just a few careful turns of the soil, the earth gave up its first secret. It was not just a bone, it was a testament to a life stolen. The silence that followed was absolute. In that moment, the investigation into a single missing teenager, Robert Peast, transformed into something far more vast and terrible. They were not just looking for one boy anymore. They were standing on top of a graveyard. The excavation began in earnest as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard. The process was slow and agonizingly meticulous. Because of the low clearance of the crawlspace, the officers could not use heavy machinery. They had to crawl on their hands and knees in the damp mud, using small hand spades and even their bare fingers to sift through the dirt. Each bucket of earth removed was a labor of grim necessity. The officers worked in shifts, their faces smudged with the very soil that had served as a tomb. Outside, the neighborhood was beginning to wake up to the horror next door, but inside, the only sounds were the rhythmic scrape of metal on stone and the heavy breathing of men confronted with the unthinkable. They found layers of remains, stacked with a cold, calculated efficiency that spoke of a predator who viewed his victims as nothing more than space to be filled. By the time the work was done, the numbers were staggering. 26 bodies were meticulously recovered from that narrow crawlspace alone, a concentrated well of sorrow that defied any rational explanation. But the property had more to give. 3 more victims were found buried in other parts of the yard, hidden beneath the very grass where Gacy had hosted his summer parties and performed as a clown for the neighborhood children. 29 young souls had been tucked away beneath the thin skin of the earth on Summerdale Avenue. As the scale of the discovery grew, So did the realization that the killer's hunger for violence had eventually outstripped the physical capacity of his own home. He had run out of room, his makeshift cemetery reaching its breaking point. When the crawl space could hold no more, the monster had turned to the water. The investigation expanded beyond the property lines to the Des Plaines River, where the current ran cold and unforgiving through the winter landscape. There, investigators sought the final pieces of the puzzle. 4 more bodies were recovered from the river's depths, including the young man whose disappearance had finally brought the police to that front door. This brought the final, harrowing tally to 33. Each discovery was a bell tolling for a family's hope, a final end to years of wondering and waiting. As the last of the remains were carried away in white bags, the house on Summerdale Avenue stood empty and exposed, its floorboards stripped away to reveal the darkness that had lived, quite literally, just beneath the feet of an unsuspecting world. The scene shifts from the cold, winter-gray banks of the Des Plaines River to the austere, echoing halls of the Cook County Criminal Court building. It is February 6, 1980. Outside, the Chicago wind bites at the collars of journalists and the curious, but inside, the air is heavy, stale, and unnervingly warm. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of leather soles on marble floors, a sound that heralds the beginning of a legal reckoning the city had been awaiting for over a year. The courtroom is a sea of dark wood and fluorescent light, casting long, sharp shadows across the faces of those who have come to bear witness. There is a specific scent here, one of old paper, floor wax, and the collective anxiety of a room filled with people who know they are about to stare directly into the abyss. It is a heavy, almost suffocating presence. At the defense table sits John Wayne Gacy. He appears different here, stripped of his costumes and his colorful grease paint. He wears a simple suit, a mask of suburban normalcy that feels increasingly transparent as the proceedings begin. Beside him, his attorneys, Robert Mata and Sam Amarante, prepare for a desperate gamble. Not guilty by reason of insanity. They argue that the man sitting before the jury is not a calculated predator, but a victim of his own shattered psyche. A soul whose childhood trauma and internal fractures led him to a place where he no longer knew the difference between right and wrong. They speak of a mind divided, a spirit broken by a father's cruelty, suggesting that the monster in the crawlspace was an entity born of madness rather than a man acting with malice. Across the aisle, the prosecution, led by William Kunkel and Robert Egan, prepares a very different narrative. They do not see a broken mind, they see a master of manipulation. To them, the evidence is not found in the abstract theories of psychology, but in the physical reality of the trick handcuffs. Imagine the cold, metallic click as a pair of restraints snaps shut, a sound Gacy used as a doorway to terror. The prosecution argues that this was no act of insanity, but a highly organized, repetitive ritual. They describe how Gacy would demonstrate a magic trick, luring young men into the cuffs with a smile, only to reveal the trap once the keys were hidden away. This was planning. This was control. This was a man who knew exactly what he was doing every time he turned the lock. The most harrowing moment of the trial comes when the defense, in a risky tactical maneuver, calls Jeffrey Rignall to the stand. They hope his account of the torture will convince the jury of Gacy's insanity, but his presence stands as a testament to the horror that 33 others could no longer speak of. He recounts the night in 1978 when he was lured into a car, chloroformed, and taken to that house on Summerdale Avenue. He describes the wooden board, the chains, and the unimaginable pain he endured. As he speaks, his voice wavers, caught in the throat of a memory too heavy to carry. He tells the court how he woke up in a park, beaten and broken, and how he spent his own money to find his attacker. His testimony is a raw wound. The defense brings forward its own parade of experts, 6 psychologists and psychiatrists, including Dr. Richard Rappaport. They talk for days about schizophrenia and multiple personality disorders, trying to paint a picture of a man who lived in a dissociative fog. They recount the beatings Gacy took as a child, the verbal abuse, and the early signs of a personality splitting under pressure. But as the trial moves into March, the weight of the evidence begins to tip the scales. The jury watches closely as the prosecution cross-examine these experts, pointing out the meticulous way Gacy disposed of the bodies and the way he maintained his public image. The insanity defense begins to look like a thin veil for a very deliberate darkness that the law simply cannot excuse, no matter how many theories are presented. On March 12, 1980, the testimony finally reaches its end. The jury retreats to a small room to deliberate. Many expected them to stay there for days, weighed down by the gravity of 33 counts of murder. Instead, they return in less than 2 hours. The courtroom's silence is absolute. When the clerk reads the verdict, the word guilty repeats like a rhythmic pulse 33 times. Each count is a name, a life, a story cut short. John Wayne Gacy listens with a blank, cold expression. The judge then slowly delivers the final sentence: death. It is the end of the legal journey, though the heavy echoes of those names will linger long after the lights are dimmed. After the verdict of 1980, the world moved on, but for the man in the cell, time became a stagnant thing. For 14 years, John Wayne Gacy lived within the stone walls of the Menard Correctional Center. The energy of the trial was replaced by the rhythmic clang of steel doors. In this quiet, he turned to the canvas. We can imagine the smell of oil paints filling the small space, vibrant reds and deep blues. He painted the very thing that had become his shadow, the clown. These paintings eventually found their way into the world, a strange postscript to a life of darkness. As the 1980s faded into the 1990s, every appeal was a fraying thread, and one by one, they snapped. The families of the 33 young men waited in suspended grief, their lives forever altered. In the silence of the night, perhaps they thought of the empty chairs at their tables and the questions that still hung in the air. For 8 of those families, the pain was sharpened by a lack of a name. Their sons were known only by numbers assigned by the precision of an examiner. These were the ghosts that haunted the case as his final day on Earth drew near. On that spring night, the air at the Stateville Correctional Center was cool. Gacy had been moved from Menard for his final hours. He was in a talkative mood, a final performance for the guards. The ritual of the last meal is a somber tradition. For his final repast, he requested 12 pieces of fried shrimp, a bucket of original recipe chicken, French fries, and a pound of fresh strawberries. One can almost hear the crunch of the batter and the scent of the berries. It was a final indulgence before the clock struck midnight, and the world prepared to say a heavy goodbye to the killer. Just after midnight, the process began. Witnesses sat behind a glass partition in a thick silence. Gacy was strapped to the gurney, his final statement a defiant rejection of remorse. As the chemicals flowed, a malfunction occurred. A clog in the line caused a delay, stretching the execution to 18 minutes. It was a tense interval in the dimly lit chamber. The technicians worked quickly, and finally the process resumed. At 12:58 in the morning, the man who had brought so much terror to Chicago took a final breath. The state closed the chapter on his life, but the story of his victims remained unfinished and raw. Years turned into decades, and the house on Summerdale Avenue was replaced by a new home. In the year 2011, a new effort began. Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart decided that modern technology might finally give the remaining 8 victims their names. The remains were exhumed from county cemeteries. Forensic science had evolved. The reliance on dental records was now supplemented by DNA. Scientists began the painstaking work of extracting genetic codes from bone, looking for the markers that would connect these lost boys to the families who had spent a lifetime hoping for answers in the dark of night. The first success came when William George Bundy, a 19-year-old who vanished in 1976, was identified. His family finally had a name for a headstone. In 2017, another breakthrough occurred. A nephew of a missing teenager from Minnesota reached out to the investigators. James Byron Hawkinson, known for decades as victim number 24, was finally given back his identity. He was only 16 when he left home, a boy with a sunny smile who called his mother just before disappearing. The news brought a profound closure to his siblings, ending a 40-year mystery and bringing him home at last to rest with his family. The search continued into 2021. Using genetic genealogy, the team identified Francis Wayne Alexander, who had been known for over 40 years as victim number 5. He was 21 years old, a man who had moved to Chicago from North Carolina. His family had always assumed he had simply moved on. These identifications are scientific triumphs that restore dignity to the dead. They take the power away from the monster and give it back to the lives he tried to erase. There are still 5 sets of remains waiting for their names, 5 families waiting for a knock on the door that will finally bring their boys back. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.